Have you ever felt like outside forces were shaping your identity? Like, maybe expectations from society or your family or even the media were kind of molding you into someone you weren't quite sure you wanted to be. Well, that's what we're diving into today with Roots and Wings
Wow.
by Moana Bombando, which just came out a few days ago on March 25th.
Yeah, this book really digs into the relationship between colonialism and identity and, how those historical forces are still playing out today.
It's not just dry history, though, is it? I mean, Bombando really brings it to life with personal stories kind of woven into the analysis.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about understanding how our personal journeys are connected to these larger systems of power.
So the book kind of jumps right in with this concept of identity stripping as a tool of economic dominance. Can you unpack that a bit for us? What does that actually look like and how does it work?
Well, it's about taking away people's sense of self to make them easier to exploit. Think about the forced renaming of enslaved Africans, or the suppression of indigenous languages, and even the destruction of cultural artifacts and sacred sites. It's not just about physical domination, it's about breaking people's spirits and making them dependent on the colonizers.
It's almost like creating a void where their sense of belonging and cultural pride used to be, and then filling it with whatever serves the colonizer's interests.
Precisely. Yeah, the book argues that this psychological manipulation has long-lasting consequences, leading to internalized oppression and generational trauma.
Okay, so to really understand this, Bombando takes us way back, right? It's not just about the recent past.
Yes, it's fascinating how chapter 2 goes all the way back to ancient civilizations like Egypt, the Vikings, and the Roman Empire. It was surprising to see how empires even centuries ago used tactics that eerily foreshadow later colonial practices.
When I got to that part, I was thinking about the Roman Empire and how they were known for incorporating elements of conquered cultures into their own.
Hmm.
I always thought it was about creating this diverse, inclusive society.
That's how it was often presented, but the book argues it was a more insidious form of control. It created the illusion of integration while maintaining the power imbalance. They would adopt certain aspects of the conquered culture, reinterpret them, and then use them to legitimize their rule.
So instead of crushing a culture outright, they'd sort of absorb it and twist it to their own advantage.
Exactly. And it made it harder for people to resist because their own cultural elements were being used against them. It's a subtle form of manipulation that's still very much at play in the world today.
It makes you wonder how much of what we consider our culture today is actually rooted in this kind of appropriation and reinterpretation.
That's a great point. It's a challenge to disentangle those influences, and that's part of what the book is prompting us to do.
All right, so we've seen how empires throughout history have tried to dominate and erase identities, but people have always fought back, haven't they?
Absolutely. Chapter 3 delves into the inspiring stories of resistance. What I found really interesting is how diverse the methods were. It wasn't just about armed rebellions.
Yeah, the book talks about cultural preservation, right?
Yeah.
Like people clinging to their languages, music, and traditions as a form of defiance.
Right. And there were also examples of strategic political maneuvering within the colonial systems, people using the colonizers' own laws and institutions to challenge their power.
Like that example with the Igbo Women's War in Nigeria in 1929, those women organized a massive protest against British policies, but they did it using their traditional songs, dances, and social networks. It just shows you how resistance can be creative and adaptable.
And incredibly powerful, that movement forced the British to reconsider some of their policies and recognize the strength of women's collective action.
Now, it's easy to think of colonialism as something from the past, but the book brings us right into the present with this concept of neocolonialism. Can you explain how that works and how it connects to this idea of identity?
It's about understanding how those old patterns of domination have evolved instead of direct military control. We see things like economic dependency.
So countries might be politically independent, but they're still reliant on former colonial powers for trade, investment, and aid.
Exactly. And then there's political manipulation, where powerful countries exert influence through things like diplomatic pressure and international organizations and even covert operations.
But it's not just about economics and politics, right? There's a cultural element to it as well.
Yes, Bombando calls it cultural hegemony. It's about how the dominant culture's values, beliefs, and narratives become so pervasive that they're seen as natural and universal even by those they are meant to control.
So it's like a subtle form of mind control, where you start to internalize the colonizer's worldview without even realizing it.
Precisely, think about the global dominance of Western media, fashion, music, and even beauty standards. It shapes our desires, aspirations, and even our sense of self-worth.
It's almost like colonialism has gone underground, operating in these invisible ways that are harder to pinpoint and resist.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of these forces, to understand how they operate, and to develop strategies for reclaiming our own agency.
All right, so we've established that colonialism, both past and present, has had a profound impact on identity. But where do we go from here? How do we grapple with these legacies and create a more just and equitable world?
Well, that's what the rest of the book explores, and it starts to get even more nuanced and thought-provoking.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. So tell me, what are some of the key paradoxes and challenges that Bombando highlights in the next few chapters? So you're saying the rest of the book really digs into these challenging questions of how we move forward. What are some of the things Bombando brings up?
Well, in Chapter 5, there's this fascinating discussion about what the book calls enforced democracy.
That sounds like a contradiction. How can democracy be enforced? Isn't the whole point of democracy that it comes from the people?
Exactly, and that's what makes this chapter so interesting. Bombando argues that imposing Western-style democracy on societies with different cultural and historical contexts can actually backfire.
So instead of liberating people, it can actually cause more problems.
Right. The book gives the example of the U.S. intervention in Iraq. The idea was to establish a democratic government, but it ended up destabilizing the country and creating chaos.
Because they tried to impose a system that didn't fit the existing social structures and cultural values.
Yes, and the book argues that this kind of enforced democracy often ignores local customs, traditional power dynamics, and even different understandings of what democracy means in those cultures.
It's like trying to force a plant to grow in the wrong kind of soil.
Hmm.
It might look like it's taking root, but it's not going to thrive.
That's a great analogy, and it raises this really important question. How do we balance the ideals of democracy with the need to respect diverse governance systems and cultural identities? It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Definitely. And it's not just about political systems, is it? The book also tackles the impact of imposed religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, on African societies.
Yes, Chapter 6 goes into how religion was often used as a tool of control during colonial periods.
So instead of being a source of spiritual connection, it became another way to assert dominance.
Exactly. The book talks about how indigenous spiritual practices were often demonized or suppressed, and conversion to Christianity or Islam was sometimes forced or strongly encouraged.
Which makes me think about how many people were cut off from their ancestral traditions and beliefs. I imagine that caused a lot of spiritual confusion and a sense of dispossession.
That's exactly what the book argues. This loss of spiritual grounding and the severing of ties to traditional ways of life had a devastating impact on many communities. It created a sense of spiritual disconnection and cultural alienation that has persisted for generations.
And that probably feeds into this ongoing search for meaning and belonging that so many people experience today. If you've been cut off from your roots, it's hard to know where you belong.
It's a profound insight, and it really connects the historical impact of colonialism to our personal experiences today.
This is all making me think about how we learn about the world and the ways that knowledge itself can be a tool of power.
That's a perfect segue to Chapter 7, which focuses on colonial education. It examines how these systems were designed to dismantle indigenous intellectual traditions and replace them with a Eurocentric worldview.
So it wasn't just about teaching facts and figures. It was about shaping how people thought and understood the world.
Exactly. The book talks about how local knowledge systems, histories, and philosophies were often dismissed as primitive or irrelevant. European languages and literature were prioritized, while African languages and oral traditions were marginalized.
I imagine that had a huge impact on people's self-esteem. If you're constantly told that your culture and your way of thinking are inferior,
Yeah.
it's bound to affect how you see yourself.
Absolutely. The book argues that this kind of educational indoctrination has contributed to a devaluation of African knowledge systems and a sense of intellectual dependency.
And that's why it's so important to be critical of the sources of information we encounter and to seek out diverse perspectives. We have to be aware of the biases embedded in the way history is taught and knowledge is presented.
It's about reclaiming the power to define our own narratives and to value the richness and complexity of different knowledge systems.
It seems like this connects to the next chapter, which is about social media. That's another powerful force shaping how we see the world and ourselves, right?
Yes. Chapter 8 dives into the double-edged sword of social media.
On one hand, it seems like it has the potential to connect people across cultures and give voice to marginalized communities.
Absolutely. And the book acknowledges that social media can be a powerful tool for sharing information, mobilizing movements, and challenging dominant narratives.
But I can also see how it could be used to reinforce colonial patterns of thought and behavior.
That's exactly what Bombando cautions against the book, warns about the dangers of cultural commodification, misrepresentation, and the spread of harmful stereotypes.
It's like that saying, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Even if we're using new technology, we have to be careful not to replicate the same power dynamics that have been used to oppress people for centuries.
Right, and the book challenges us to be mindful of our own social media experiences. Who are we connecting with? What narratives are we consuming? And how is this shaping our understanding of ourselves and the world?
It's a reminder that social media is a powerful tool that can be used for good or bad. It's up to us to be conscious consumers and creators of digital culture.
And to use it in a way that promotes understanding, respect, and authentic connection across cultures.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored how colonialism has shaped identity from ancient empires to modern neocolonialism, from enforced democracy to the complexities of social media. It's pretty intense stuff, but Bombando doesn't leave us in a state of despair, does he?
Not at all. In the final chapter, he offers a hopeful vision for the future. He calls it Wings, transforming roots into empowered futures. And it shifts the focus from the problems to the solutions. It's about reclaiming our power to shape our destinies, both as individuals and as communities.
So it's not about erasing the past or pretending these legacies of colonialism don't exist, but rather about acknowledging them and figuring out how to move forward.
Exactly. It's about understanding the ways those historical forces are still operating today and then consciously choosing how we want to respond.
It's like we've been handed this complicated puzzle, and now we have to figure out how to put the pieces back together in a way that makes sense for us.
I like that analogy. It highlights the agency we have in this process. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we want to shape the future.
So what are some of the concrete steps that Bombando suggests we take?
Well, he talks about the importance of supporting movements for reparations and restorative justice, addressing the economic inequalities that stem from colonialism. It's about acknowledging the harm that was done and finding ways to repair it.
That makes sense. If colonialism was about extracting resources and wealth from certain parts of the world, then part of decolonization has to be about redistributing those resources more equitably.
Absolutely. He also talks about the need to decolonize education systems.
So not just adding a few books by authors of color to the curriculum, but really rethinking the whole structure of how we learn.
Exactly. It's about incorporating diverse perspectives, valuing indigenous knowledge systems, and teaching history in a way that is honest and nuanced. It's about creating space for multiple narratives and challenging the Eurocentric biases that are so deeply embedded in our institutions.
It sounds like a huge undertaking, but also incredibly important if we want to break free from these colonial patterns of thought.
And it's not just about institutions. Bombando also emphasizes the power of individual actions. He talks about the need to amplify marginalized voices, to challenge racist and discriminatory language and behavior, and to support businesses and organizations that are working to create a more just and equitable world.
So it's about being mindful of the choices we make every day and using our voices and our resources to support positive change.
Yes, and recognizing that these issues are interconnected. The liberation of one group is ultimately tied to the liberation of all.
I love that it's not just about individual empowerment, but about collective liberation. It's really inspiring.
That's the heart of Bombando's message. He believes in the resilience of the human spirit, the power of resistance, and the possibility of creating a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. It's not going to be easy, but it's a vision worth fighting for.
This deep dive has been a real journey. So many thought-provoking ideas and connections. It's definitely left me with a lot to think about and a renewed sense of hope.
I think that's what Bombando intended. He wants this book to be a conversation starter, a catalyst for reflection and action.
Well, he's definitely achieved that. For anyone listening who wants to learn more about these issues and explore these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Roots and Wings by Mfwana Bombando. It's a powerful and timely book that challenges us to think critically about the world we live in and our place in it.
And as you continue to explore these ideas, I want to leave you with a question. If identity is shaped by both our roots and our wings, what are the forces that help us take flight even in the face of historical challenges? What are the sources of strength and resilience that allow us to rise above the limitations that have been imposed upon us?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I'm sure we'll be revisiting these themes again in the future. Until next time.